October 19th, 1990, in Alaska, three friends decide to go target shooting, something that is a fairly common occurrence when weather permits it. Douglas Gustafson, Raymond Cheeley, and George Kerr traveled to the Eklutna gravel pit. They brought with them an HK-91 that Douglas had purchased that day. After shooting, the crew loaded into their car and began traveling from Eagle River to Anchorage. Douglas was in the passenger seat with the rifle on his lap. Raymond drove, and George was in the back seat. While driving, Raymond mentioned that a red Toyota had attempted to rub up against the side of their car. The two men in the front decided to do something insane. Raymond moved the car into position, allowing Douglas to roll down his window. Douglas used the door for balance. He aimed and pulled the trigger of his rifle. The two men in the red Toyota had no idea what was happening or about to happen. The driver, Robert Chamberlain, slowed down to enter an exit ramp. His passenger was a young man named Jeffrey Kane. When the vehicle slowed, the crack of a bullet rang in the air, and Jeffrey, the passenger of the Toyota, was struck in the back of the head. He was dead instantly. Douglas had just murdered a man, but because they fled, he would not know until the next morning. When he saw the news, he realized that his shot had killed the vehicle's passenger. Douglas worked to dispose of the gun that was used. Then he called George. He told him to tell no one, and that the evidence had been taken care of. But George, unlike the others, had a conscience. He went to his boss. His boss, thinking on his feet, got George a lawyer. After that, on October 20th, the very next day, he went to the police. George would ask to wear a wire. While police set things up, George called his father to tell him he was going to wear the wire and get Douglas to talk. It was not until later that George and police learned that Raymond was actually with George's father and seemed to have a strange want to know what was said on the call. Police spent time attempting to line up a location as well as just locating Raymond and Douglas in general. Finally, they had an opportunity and drove George to meet with Douglas at the airport that he worked in the vicinity of. On the drive, George also admitted that the men had burglarized a local meat market, stealing $19,000 in cash. The state's assistant attorney made the decision to give him immunity for those crimes before they arrived at the airport because he was willing to wear the wire. During the monitored conversation, Douglas told George that the HK-91 rifle was hidden in the shipyard and railroad area below downtown Anchorage, and that he intended either to modify or destroy the weapon to break any potential prosecution for the shooting. Douglas then left the airport, and the police picked him up to re-interview him. The state would go forward with charges. Douglas and Raymond would go to prison. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. See, Douglas went to prison, but he was not finished yet. He had family, and that family wanted revenge. Some might choose to target lawyers, judges, or cops, but not in this case. The only option for revenge was George Kerr, the key witness in the prosecution of Douglas Gustafson and Raymond Cheeley. So a plan came to form. Douglas had a sister, and her name was Peggy Gustafson. She would begin visiting Douglas in prison, something that seemed normal. As she publicly had stated, she believed her brother was innocent. Her claim was that George was in fact the shooter, and her brother was simply in jail because George had got to the cops first and flipped on the group. She felt George had thrown Raymond and Douglas under the bus, leading to their arrests and sentences. It would be at this point someone might ask, did the police afford protection to George or his family? He was of course the star witness for the state. He went to the cops in the first place, telling them he was worried about his safety. Even though that was the case, the police did not. No police check-ins, no witness protection, nothing. George and his family were on their own. Peggy began visiting Douglas more and more. She was not just talking about the case or life. No, she and her brother had something far more violent in mind. Behind prison walls, Douglas and Raymond had constructed a plan to get revenge on the man who had turned them in to police. They used their basic experience in explosives to hatch the plan for a mail bombing. Douglas would use the visits with his sister to pass information to her. She would take this info to her other brother, Craig Gustafson. Peggy and Craig would then begin making said bombs slowly but surely, with the information being fed to them. On September 17, 1991, a package would arrive at the home of David Kerr. David was the father of George Kerr, but George was not home, and his father, a 44-year-old postal worker, decided to open the package himself. When he opened the package, it blew up. Rocking the very ground, the blast killed David and greatly injured his wife. George would learn of the explosion soon after. The police would connect the dots and arrest all involved. Although during trial, Peggy attempted to use the fact that she was pregnant as a way to curb prison time, she argued she had a hormone imbalance. The jury was not convinced, and she received 24 years in prison. Craig received over 20 years, and even more time was added to the two men already behind bars for murder. In 1995, the victims of the bombing sued the state of Alaska, the argument being that the prison held some form of fault for allowing the bomb and plan to be created under their noses. At trial, the stepmother of George, who survived the bombing, let it be known she was hospitalized in intensive care for more than a month. She claimed a lost sense of smell and taste, a destroyed airway, 3,000 shrapnel wounds, and permanent vision loss. The plaintiffs contended the prisoners against whom their son testified conspired with persons on the outside to design, build, and mail the bomb. The plaintiffs further contended the bomb was designed on paper in the prison. 2 bomb switches had been smuggled into the prison, and that prison officials never listened to 3 recorded phone calls in which the prisoners discussed the bombing in veiled conversations. At trial, plaintiffs were awarded $11,800,000 with a finding that prison officials were 12% at fault in the bombing. The Department of Corrections subsequently settled for $2,600,000. Well, that was an insane story. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, subscribe to Outlawed Thoughts and leave a comment telling me what you want me to talk about next. Also, don't forget, follow my Twitter at Liberty Layton.